Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So we got a provincial election this week. We've got federal leaders debates for the Liberal Party campaign tonight and tomorrow. We've got interesting things happening in the United States. And so I thought it'd be really good to check in with John Wright, who is a veteran pollster, someone who I really admire. He's got a pulse on what's going on from a polling standpoint, but also, I think, a really good pulse on campaigning and the politics. And so, John Wright, welcome to the show, sir.
Great to be with you, Brian.
Thank you. So let's talk Ontario politics. Thursday is the election. Where do you think the campaigns are set from a polling standpoint, first of all, and then what do you think about the campaign so far?
Well, I think the numbers have moved for the opposition parties, but they really haven't moved that much for the government. So the government went in with about 44% of the public supporting them. And I think we're going to end up possibly between 40 and 44% anyways. And I say possibly because it all depends on the weather. It all depends on, if you take a look at some people may feel that it's a foregone conclusion that the Ford government's going to win. And they might say, geez, I don't know whether I should go out tonight or today and vote. So there are some of those factors, but certainly, the campaign itself, from a tactical and strategic point of view, hit all the marks. They went early. People can argue whether it's an unnecessary election or not. I think you and I have been in politics a long time and have heard that used many times. I'm not sure it has that much traction, but they hit their mark. They anticipated that there would be issues dealing with tariffs. The dissatisfaction with this government is fairly high at about 60% on almost every policy issue, except for this issue in protecting jobs against Donald Trump and the tariffs, where a majority, 53%, in fact, say that that's the case and that they would back this government. So you can see the slipstream that they've pulled into, and I don't think much is going to change between now and the end of the campaign. So then you take a look at the other campaigns. The Liberals, in fact...
But before you go there, I apologize. I think that the issue on early election was an issue at the beginning, but it sort of dissipates after it's actually been called. Like it's a complaint that you can justifiably make at the beginning, but it doesn't seem to have had legs through the whole campaign. And then it was also interesting to me that, in that first debate up in the north, Trump and tariffs were front and center often. In the second debate, the big debate, it almost wasn't addressed at all. So tell me about those two issues and how they play over time.
Sure. Well, the Trump tariff issue is the most commonly known issue in the country. 78% of Canadians say that they're more aggressively buying Canadian things. You and I can go to the grocery store and find people in front of counters now with their iPhones checking where it's made, where it's not made. I mean, people are engaged very much with this. I refer to it as kind of the Phil Spector wall of sound politics. It is everything that we have, whether it be about the hockey game that we just witnessed, or whether it be about the politics federally or provincially. It is there. It is front and center. It is all of those things. So even if you get into a debate and you are going to address the other issues, they're not really punching through against the government constituency. I mean, and that's evident all the way through this campaign. And even the polling, as I said, in the last week has shown that it is the dominant issue. Try and think of it this way. In order to get a majority government, both federally and provincially, because we're made up with the numerous parties that we have, you only need 37% of the vote. So that should land right there and sort of go, well, if you only need 37% of the vote.
And you're saying the Tories are between 40 and 44 right now.
So there you go. And then federally, much the same way, that if you don't look at the Mark Carney situation, Pierre Poilievre is sitting around 41%. So both of those numbers, provincially and federally, are solid majority numbers. And they haven't really moved a whole lot in the last period of time. So when you look provincially, you can talk about healthcare. The debates are not really debates anymore. They're spectacles that you and I will watch. People yell at each other and they throw a bunch of stuff at each other. The next day, though, whether you and I determine who wins a debate or not, it's the clips that come in the next day that play through the news cycle, and they matter. But it's clear that, the premier walked away. There is no knockout punch. His numbers in the post part of that are all the same. So I don't think anybody's listening to the other issues unless you're a Liberal committed voter or an NDP voter and you're willing to open your eyes and switch to the Liberals. But if you're Tory, you went into this campaign supporting the premier, there really hasn't been very much movement since. And the only thing they really have to worry about right now is making sure that they get the vote out. As an anecdote, I was out voting in the advance poll on Saturday. Very, very quiet, very quiet. I'm not sure that that's a great sign for the opposition parties. They want to be getting people out early, and it's very quiet at the polls in Midtown Toronto. So we'll see what happens. But I don't think anybody's got another issue on their minds unless they are with one of the other camps. I think the Tory vote's pretty solid. I call it Fortress Tory. It really hasn't dented since the outset of the campaign.
So I interrupted you when you were going to launch into a critique of the Liberal campaign. Let me just ask you, in the last provincial election, my understanding is that what ended up happening is with Stephen Del Duca as the leader, the turnout for the Liberals went down dramatically. So that from a poll standpoint, they might have actually been doing better in the polls, but even people that supported the Liberal Party just didn't come out and vote. Has the Liberal campaign changed things?
Well, yes and no. So first of all, in the last campaign, we have to remember that we came off of COVID and people were just really fatigued. And also there wasn't really much that they wanted to punch back against the government. The Ford government started with its first victory at 40.5%. In the next election, which was post-COVID, they ended up with 41%, so roughly the same vote. And they are heading towards the polls right now between 40 and 44%. So there's a solid 4 in 10 voters when you only need 37% who are voting for the government. However, when you took a look at the last campaign, the Del Duca campaign wasn't very well run. And even simple things. I mean, him showing up to campaigns when the traditional color of the Liberals is red, wearing a blue vest, is not, inspiring from an executional point of view. I think what's happened this time is a little bit different, but I think the Crombie campaign has benefited from the rise in Liberal fortunes. And let me try and put that in perspective. In late September, I did polling in 4 major centers across the country, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, and Toronto, publicly released, 800 sample in each one of them, which is a large sample, and found when we asked questions about the vote for Trudeau, that the Trudeau Liberal vote was sitting at about 19% on average. In other words, even before he brought it down to 19% in January in the polls, there was an underlying group of people who said, come hell or high water, I'm sticking with Justin Trudeau, and it was 19%. Everybody else had moved over pretty much to the NDP and the Conservatives. But then I asked the question that was, if you could have another Liberal leader, so this is back in September, late September, would you consider taking a second look at the Liberal Party? And lo and behold, an average of 30% of those who had committed themselves over to the Conservatives and the NDP, but particularly the NDP, said, yeah, I'm willing to take another look. That would have brought the vote back up to about 28% in the average there. So what do we have? We have Justin Trudeau in January, who's driven the vote federally down to about 19%. We then have his resignation, and the numbers come up to about 25. So, the poll that was being done then showed that there was some spring left in it, and it ate that up. Now what we're seeing is the anti-Trump, anti-American, anti-tariff, issue play into that. And 2 things have happened. Number one is there's a resiliency to the federal vote that wasn't there before. Mark Carney people are open to listening about Mark Carney. He's not very well defined, but if you do the head-to-head with Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, so not the direct vote, which today shows 41-31, something like that, then you get much closer. People are saying, well, you know what, Mark Carney, I think I could go with him. It's all being scooped up pretty much from the NDP vote, but it gets them within Mark Carney at 37, Pierre Poilievre and his Conservatives about 41. So you can see that there's a spread here happening at the expense of the NDP. So what does that do to provincial politics? Well, number one, for most people, unlike you and me, who just go about their jobs and didn't even know there was a debate the other night, don't really care. They listen, to the clips on the radio. They'll hear things. Maybe they'll see social media, which is the most active place where they're going to see things. But there's a sense that the Liberals are doing better. there's a sense that, you know what, it's okay to put a sign on my lawn if you're a little more active, because Mr. Trudeau's not there. And he was a huge drag on the brand. And so what you've seen since that time mirrors very much what's going on federally. You see this lift in the provincial fortunes, which is now running about 31%. Isn't that interesting? It's kind of that Liberal brand is running around 31%. You're seeing the NDP now on a head-to-head basis with Jagmeet Singh, Mark Carney, and Pierre Poilievre. It drops to 10%. They're dropping from 18 to 10. So you can see this movement where the Liberals are cannibalizing the NDP vote. Okay, so what do we see in the election campaign here? We see the NDP vote kind of holding, you know, they're dropping back in the urban areas, and the Liberals are moving ahead. We see Bonnie Crombie and her call out at the end of the debate for the NDP voters to go with her. We see that then go through the news cycle the next day. That is the clip that's used, and then she echoes it again during the course of that day and in her speech to the Canadian Club. So we start to see in the urban centers of Toronto, Ottawa, London, and a few other places, even Hamilton, where there's some softness for the NDP, and the Liberals start to pick up the vote. So I bring it home to more of a lived experience. Brian, I live in St. Paul's riding, is in Midtown Toronto, which has been ground zero basically for the federal and the provincial Liberals. The riding here has a Liberal backbone to it. It currently has a Conservative member federally, elected by about 5,000 members on a very, very weak turnout by the Liberals because they didn't like what was going on with Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau is being removed. I don't know what it's going to do for Don Stewart, who won here, but we'll see who runs in this riding. And there are rumors about everybody from Mark Carney himself running here to Evan Solomon, who is the former broadcaster. But what I've seen in the riding provincially now are signs. Stephanie Smythe, formerly of CP24, broadcaster, a recognizable name, is in this riding. And all of a sudden, Liberal signs are up where they weren't in the last campaign. Jill Andrews, who has owned this riding now for the last 2 terms, she's the NDP candidate, is now, you know, in a pretty fierce battle to own this, to keep this seat. So I think that that's what's happened across the board. You've got not necessarily an Ontario Liberal campaign that's breaking through, because the execution of that campaign has been terrible in so many ways. But I think there's a lift coming from the feds. It's scooping out a lot of the NDP vote. And the question is whether they get them out to the polls. And as I said, you know, on the weekend, the advance poll that I went to in Midtown Toronto was vacant. And that's not a good sign, but we'll see what happens, especially if it snows badly. You know, I was taking a look on the forecast. It's possible that we're going to get, you know, 3 centimeters, you know, on election night. You know, these things can have an impact, but we'll see what happens.
Well, the turnout last time was something like 42%, wasn't it?
Yeah, and as I said, there's a lot of fatigue. We were coming out of COVID. There was not really a sense that a lot of change should be made. And the 40% who stuck, again, you may get lower turnout, but you're still getting that 40.1, 40.5% turnout for Ford. And he still got them today. The difference is what's the issues and what are the leaders. And I would say the NDP have run, you know, a fairly good campaign, but it hasn't caught the traction. The Crombie campaign, you know, very badly executed for the first 2 weeks. The leader catching on to being a provincial leader in the mid part of the campaign, but still mixed message. I'll give you an example. On Friday, the Liberals released their platform. The leader, Bonnie Crombie, is talking about holding taxes, right? Like that was, you know, we're going to hold your tax. We're going to, you know, which is the same mantra of what Premier Ford was doing. When you look at the platform, though, it's all about slashing taxes. Whether or not they're trying to hold their fire because they don't want to scare off the NDP vote, which in fact is advocating for more taxes, 80% on the capital gains, you know, holding the line on certain taxes up to $220,000, but beyond that, you know, taxing the rich and taxing homes. Like that's a typical NDP standard. But when you look at the Liberal platform, and I read through all of this stuff, yes, it's about healthcare. Yes, it's about reinvestment. Yes, it's about all those things that you would hope a regular campaign would put in the window. There's a whole section on slashing taxes. And it's an interesting juxtaposition, because you'd think that that would be the Conservative platform, but it's not. Many of those things haven't come through. The execution of it, even at the Canadian Club, the speech there, I was watching with somebody, and for the first 10 minutes, we both looked at each other and said, where did this Bonnie Crombie come from? She's fantastic. She's really got it. And then careened into this, she's with business people, and, she was doing kind of a TED talk, but then it careened into this 7 or 8 minute discussion about her dad and mental health. And it really brought the room down really to a floor level. And she was almost in tears, and then kind of bounced back for the last 5 minutes and said, yeah, but we got to beat Ford about this and that. That's a jumble. That's not, I'm not denigrating anything she says about her personal life, but in a campaign, you've only got so much time to put 2 or 3 things on the table, and you want to cut through. You want to cut through all those, the wall of sound that's going on out there. I don't know whether or not that was the appropriate place to say, and we're unveiling our campaign budget fully in platform fully. And what we're going to do is we're going to slash taxes. We're going to do this. We're going to do that, and just stick to the business side. But you miss the opportunity. So I'd say that, to rate the campaigns, you'd have to give the Conservatives, and I'm not being politic here, you'd have to give them an A. Absolutely, maybe an A+. Pick the time, pick exactly where the ball was headed, knew the curve, knew how to hit it. There you go. You'd have to give a B or a B+ to the NDP campaign, but it hasn't had the traction that it could. It hasn't punched through. You'd have to give the Crombie campaign the best wind at its back, but you got to give it a C- for execution, because whether it's the first time when she was sitting, standing outside in Barrie with the wind blowing and going around and not really nailing the issue, to being in downtown Toronto and talking about safety on subways and committing $4 billion to the door going back and forth to protect people at the subway. It's just seemed like a bit of a jumble, but I think they may benefit from the federal lift, but the campaign itself, I don't think has been that great.
On the debates, she's been attacking, and a lot of people have commented negatively about that, but then they say that's what gets picked up the next day in the social media clips. So is the attack, the sort of very aggressive, irate attack, good or bad?
Well, that's what I said at the very outset of this discussion. You have to cut through. In the debate, in fact, it was not necessarily her very hot. That's what they call it in our business, right? You got a hot approach to things. It's not what cut through, but the group of us who analyze these things, and I've done polling for now, how many years now? It's almost 40. And I've gone through campaigns where, you have people sitting in rooms and they've got little dials and tell you who they like and who they don't. And I've done pre-campaign polls, and then, for CTV and Global, and then you release them, an hour after it's taken place, showing who the winner was. And it's a very different group of people who watch debates and think about them and technically, use them. And then the next day, other people think completely differently. And that's the vast majority. I think there's a chance to find a middle ground in all of that. And I would say that the emotional attacks that took place the other night were not helpful. They're not helpful because none of them resonated and got through, and it didn't appear that she was premier-like. I do think that when she was at the Canadian Club for the first 10 minutes, there was a new Bonnie Crombie that showed up, and she was very premier-like, and people want to see that. But notice again, it wasn't the cuts that got through that were yelling and over top of each other. The clip that got through was the one that she did at the very, very end. And when we were watching that live and commentating, it's where all of us snapped our heads up and went, that's it right there. Because she was doing something very different. She was being very strategic, and the clip was very measured, and that's what got carried the next day. So I'm not one that really believes at all that there are many knockouts in any except that Brian Mulroney, John Turner night. It just doesn't happen.
You could have shown leadership.
You had an option, sir. You had an option. I was watching it. You were watching it. Those of us of the ancien regime understood it all and what happened that night. But oftentimes what happens, I look at the Americans and how they run their campaigns. The things that I remember are oftentimes of humor, not of knockout. I mean, I remember Ronald Reagan saying,
I will make an issue out of my
age
opponent's inexperience and young age.
Yeah, see, you and I remember these things. So I don't believe that people tune in, nor do candidates show up at a lot of these debates because they think they're not going to get anything out of it. If you are a supporter of the Liberals, your talking points are that it was a good policy night. It was a good night because we held them to the fire. But look at the ratings. No one's showing up to watch it except a whole lot of pundits, and it's not really helpful. It's the next day, and I think again the clip that the leader of the Liberal Party provincially got, and in fact is working for her the most strategically, is a call out to the NDP to cross over so they can form an effective opposition to the Conservatives.
Ford. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with John Wright talking about politics in Canada and frankly around the world. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got John Wright, a veteran pollster, a gentleman that I think very highly of, and his sense of what's going to be successful in politics based on his polling background, but also based on his just watching of campaigns and his experience with campaigns. John, I wonder if we could switch just for a second. We've got the first leaders debate for the Liberal Party federal campaign this evening, another one tomorrow. What do you think is happening there?
Well, I think a few things, going along with what I said earlier, I think there's Justin Trudeau was the biggest drag on the party. I think people are tired of Trudeau. I think people have tired generally of him since about 2020, 21, 22, in that range. You can see it in the numbers. But I think, the long dance to leave the party was inevitable, that he was going to have to leave or drive the Liberal Party into the ground where they ended up with handfuls of seats.
The visceral negative reaction to him, the hatred, the F Trudeau, like I've never seen that before. It was incredible.
But there's two parts to that. I mean, it's a very effective, well-funded campaign by the Conservatives who hit their mark. I mean, it's been, every day that the Prime Minister wakes up with a majority government at 37%, you have to realize that there's 63% that don't like him, right? So you already got almost 2/3 of the public against you to go into this. So you've got, a circumstance where, most people didn't like the Prime Minister, but more importantly, he's been attacked for 18 months to 2 years with a campaign that would take down anybody. So, you wake up in the morning and you look outside and it's raining, and the Conservative ad says, thanks to Trudeau, weather is terrible today. So, he's worn that. But to be fair, the policies have also worn out. And there is a tiredness that comes after 9 years anyway. So he took the party down to the 16% to 19% range, depending upon the poll. Now he's left. Now it's sprung back. There's hope. Here we go. And so we've got the federal Liberals moving in a direction of kind of Captain Canada. We've got Mr. Trudeau, who's not so much on the stage, and I would argue, even making announcements about high-speed trains and a bunch of other stuff is not helpful to the Liberal brand. But nonetheless, we've got a new person called Mark Carney, who represents at least something fresh that the public doesn't really know about, and that the Conservatives will have to unleash their campaign after the convention to, shape how they want him seen. So we have two factors going on in the polls. We have roughly 41% of the Conservative vote holding where they are versus about 31% of the Liberal vote. So it's come up, scooped out a lot from the NDP vote. but we still have a conservatives in majority territory, but there's a propensity, great word, a propensity to vote for somebody named Mark Carney. And when you put them head to head, it's, what everybody hears nowadays, it's not Freeland versus Poilievre, it's Carney. There is about a 6 to 7 percentage point of voters out there who are willing to watch and find out who this person is. So that's what makes this debate important, the English debate and also the French debate where the Liberals are up, because it will do two things. One, it will define who this Mark Carney is. We're going to see a lot of Mark Carney. He's going to be questioned. He will be debated aggressively by others on that stage. And so we'll get a good sense of, well, maybe he can hold up. Maybe he is funny. Maybe this is the kind of guy who can lead the Liberal Party. Maybe he is a choice. But we're also going to have the conservatives who are going to clip and can, as they say in the media business, everything that they can about this, whatever statement they have, whatever attacks. And so I would suggest that Mark Carney's day of debut is actually the English language debate that we're going to see. And that we're going to then identify in the French debate. And by the end of the week, we'll have a bit of a better sense of who he is. There will be some polls done based on exposure. And so by the beginning of the following week, we'll have a better sense of how he's holding up in the polls and whether there's a bounce. I don't know whether he's going to win. All I know is this, that he's replenished the federal party. Where the party was terrible, like they would have been blown out. Where they are today is in a much better position. He's given them a fighting chance. The question is whether or not he hangs in afterwards until the fall. He won't have a house he won't have a seat in the House, whether he hangs on until the fall and then decides to go somehow, or whether he comes out of the convention and has a 50-day campaign and takes it to the streets, and there we go. But whatever it's going to be, he knows that he can have Jagmeet Singh's support in the House if he goes back, because the Singh numbers are terrible. But it'll be up to his campaign and how they sort of feel they've done and whether they've got enough momentum to go ahead and at least make try for a minority, which would be about 34, 33%. Right now, I still think conservative plurality is in the making, that they will probably do better, but we'll see.
Both Kim Campbell and John Turner, when they got elected in leadership conventions and became prime ministers, had a little bit of a bounce, and they went quickly into the campaign and both lost. So that post-convention bounce didn't help them. Doug Ford, the opposite, got a bounce and it sustained it through the election. What's your advice based on your experience of what you think Carney should do? Assuming he wins.
Well, again, I'm not sure I'd be giving advice at the moment. Here's what I would say. We have a very different dynamic where we have an external threat to our country. We have the Bank of Canada, head of the Bank of Canada, who in his speech this past week said that with the Trump tariffs, if fully implemented for the period of time of the presidency or for a length of time, could have a structural GDP damage of close to 8.5% that we would not recover from. That's how existential this is. That when the head of the Bank of Canada who says, look, this ain't like COVID where we're going to get through it and go back the other side. He would have to, the head of Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklin, would have to bring down the interest rates to support people. The government's going to have to shell out a lot of money. It's pretty existential. It's not a hockey game in overtime that you win and then get on with life and say, screw you. So we're facing a time here that has a dynamic outside of this country that has had an impact on how a provincial election is going to be run and has had a successful strategy around that from the Ford campaign. And I don't know where we're going to be 30, let alone 60 days from now. I don't. So it may help, it may hinder. What I do know is that the Conservatives have yet to find that new, the new thing. They're testing some issues for traction. I think that the Conservatives can go out and announce some policies, but again, I wouldn't be the one saying get out there and say a whole lot, and let the Liberals kind of define themselves. There'll be enough there to go after. But I might say to Carney at the end of the day, you know what? You said you were going to be out in Edmonton and or out west and run. maybe you should take a run at a seat in St. Paul's riding. Maybe you should. You've got an opportunity to do so. Maybe you should get your seat there, and over the and that's the first call, and that you bring the House back afterwards, or you bring the House back then, and you get Jagmeet Singh, who's going to support you for another couple of months, so that you can have the House in session while you're doing your seat. I mean, there's a myriad of things that you could do. So I don't think I'd give any advice right now until I see where he is at the end of the actual convention, and to see whether or not there's some momentum there, or there's an issue that's there and clear and defined. But whatever way you look at it, Brian, it's going to be a real risk for the Liberals, because, you're not in a campaign, and you're still right now, there's about a 9-point gap 10-point gap between them, that gives the Conservatives a crushing majority. And we'll see whether or not by that time we've got ballot question, which has a Liberal leader named Mark Carney and then Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, head to head, coming out of a convention. I don't know. I think the conventional wisdom may be to go to a 50-day campaign right out of the convention. I think that's pretty risky, but we'll see. I don't know what advice I'd give other than I think we should hold on for a bit before we make that decision.
People talk about the election having to happen by October. Is that true? Like, they could stretch it beyond the 4-year time frame.
Yeah, this parliament doesn't. Yeah, this parliament doesn't have to go until, I think it's June of 2026. The only reason they talked about October was the deal with the NDP was in play. And I think that there's no way whatsoever that Jagmeet Singh would get into the House and bring the government down. None.
Even though we said he would.
Yeah, but he's also playing around at the margins now, saying, well, we ought to see what the government's going to do to support vis-a-vis the tariffs. Look, the numbers against Carney bring the NDP down to 10%. The numbers right now are at 18 or 17% without Carney. If you were there, you would lose all of your influence and be absolutely crushed. Why would you pull the trigger? You wouldn't. You'd be crushed. So you know what? Hang in. Time's your best friend. So I don't think that Jagmeet Singh would pull the trigger. If anybody's going to pull the trigger, it's going to be the Liberal. If the Liberals believe that they can scoop up that NDP vote, and that they can go hard and campaign for 50 days against the Conservatives with a legitimate candidate, and to win the day based on that, then they'll do it. But it won't be Jagmeet Singh. I think the Liberals have bought themselves a pass if they want, at least until the fall and maybe into the spring of next year, because I don't think that the NDP would be in their right minds to bring Jagmeet Singh down. Look, I put it this way. I think if I were an NDPer looking at those numbers, I'd be looking for a new leader, right? Like, they're terrible, and it hasn't had any traction, and the strategy hasn't. Even going on CNN and yelling that, Donald Trump, I've got your number. Don't you mess with me. Come on, really? It doesn't have any traction. But nonetheless, Jagmeet Singh, not popular in Quebec. The Liberals have bounced back in Quebec.
Let's talk about that for a second. Last time we chatted, Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois were both doing well. What's going on in Quebec right now?
Well, of course, they were doing well, and they continue to have a strong front. But what's happened is the Liberals are bouncing back. And this is the thing. People, there were a lot of blind pundits out there. A lot of them were saying, it's the Liberal brand that was hitting it. Like, if you had done the polling and seen the polling and looked at and just asked that simple question, are you willing to take a second look? You would have had 30% of the population in this country who were committed to the other party saying, yes, they were. Okay, guess what's happened? Boom, they're there. But a lot of these voters are from Missouri. Missouri's, the nickname of that state is the show me state. So they're there. They're not parked. They're there for the show. They want to see what's going on. And I think that's what's happened in Quebec. Again, the animosity targeted towards Mr. Trudeau is well earned on the backs of a Conservative campaign that's lasted almost 2 years to make him the worst thing since, I don't know, the worst thing ever in this country. Now that that's gone, the Conservatives had to find a new target and a new way of talking about that. And they've allowed the Liberal brand to refresh. And that's exactly what's happened.
We're going to take a break. with John Wright talking about politics. We've covered provincial politics in Ontario, where we've got an election coming up on Thursday. We talked about federal politics, specifically in regards to the leadership debates happening within the Liberal Party today and tomorrow. Maybe when we come back, I'm going to ask you what's going on in the United States, because you've been a follower of U.S. politics for quite a while as well.
Closely.
And, you know, that's probably issue number one in Canada and around the world. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with John Wright. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We got John Wright, a veteran pollster, someone who's been in the polling business for a couple of decades, also a close follower of politics. And you've been following not only Canadian politics, but U.S. politics. And I got to ask you, you know, we've had more change within the last month than I've ever dreamt of in my time being a news junkie and a political junkie. And, you know, to have him come out in the first couple of days and go against Mexico and Canada and tariffs and Denmark and Greenland and Panama and the Gulf of America and stuff like that. But then this week say that that Zelensky's at 4% in the popular vote and that he's a dictator and that Russia didn't start the Ukraine invasion. It was Ukraine's fault. You know, what's going on in the United States right now?
It's Donald Trump. Donald Trump 2.0. Donald Trump, who grew up, you know, being like this in not just in politics, but in business. And so, you know, what reminded me this, there's a few things to think about in politics. And you hit it about when we talked about the debate. Tone is everything. If I'd gone into Ukraine and said, in a room with the president, look, you have a refiner, an aluminum refinery here that's been very damaged, and you've got all the minerals that if we got that up and running and made an investment in it, you could probably supply a good 40% of the aluminum to the United States. We'd be willing to invest in that and to have that and to put some projection of security around the country. It would also pay back some of the stuff that we've committed to the cause. But we'd also bring in American troops in. We would, or bring in another contingent of troops, and we would make some guarantees on it. But it would mean you give up what you've got, what the Russians have right now. But nonetheless, we'd enter into this partnership. In that meeting, apparently, what happened was Zelensky said, "I'm going to take it back to my cabinet. We'll have a discussion about it." But within 24 hours, he was out basically saying, "We're not going to do this. We're not going to put it on the table. You know, I'm not going to have this kind of an arrangement." And I think what happened exactly is what happened when Mr. Trudeau came out of the meeting with the president at, I think it was the G20, and he got on a plane and he was heading home, and Mr. Trudeau held a press conference. And by the time that the president landed at the end of the runway, he was already out talking to the media, saying that Trudeau was two-faced. He bushwhacked him. You know, he hadn't agreed to do what he did, and it was the ending of that relationship as he saw it. And so the reaction from the White House was typical Donald Trump, you know, screw you, you little pipsqueak, you know, I'm going to do this, you're terrible, blah, 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 blah. So it's the same. It's the same. You want to, you know, Marco Rubio, I saw the discussion from him afterwards. If the tone had been Marco Rubio's tone, you know, I think it would have been in a better place. But what you've got is a visceral response to everything that's nasty, always nasty. And I think, again, there's a lesson for the Conservatives in this country not to be so nasty all the time, whether it be to the media or to be to others, because it's a mirror of what's going on. I think what's happening there is that this is just going to be nasty season all the time because that's who the president is. But there's some underlying things that are going on here that we also have to pay attention to. Number one, the president has the right to do a whole lot of things, just as, you know, the leader of the federal party that gets into power can make all kinds of changes. If they want to, they can change who's the head of the CBC or defund the CBC. If they want to get rid of who the chief of the defense staff is, they can do that. They can change who they want in government and agencies and all those other places. Okay. Well, in the last few days, they've changed the head of the military and a whole bunch of people went bananas. It's kind of like, no, they can do that. They can change the heads of different places. It's the tone and the aggressiveness that people are dealing with at the moment. So we're not going to lose that. That's just who Donald Trump is. But what it's doing is setting up other time frames for us to look at. In order to do what Donald Trump wants, he needs a budget. And he's not going to get a budget until May or June of this year. Number two, he's going to have to negotiate by that time with the House and with the Senate in order to do what he wants to do. And the reality is by that time, his numbers may be worse, right? So what have we got? In the last month, he's down between 7 and 13 points in almost every measure. We now have most people believing that the economy is headed in the wrong track, more up than it was before he got there. Inflation is now the biggest issue in the United States because it's up at 3% and because of where things are in the United States right now. The Fed is not going to be cutting rates like they have done here with the Bank of Canada. People are concerned. The price of eggs isn't dropping, and the reason they're high is because they're culling for bird flu, which will be a whole other issue. But inflation and pocketbook that they went to the polls about to throw Trump in on their behalf is not moving. So you're going to see between now and the implementation of what he wants to do, a steady drop in his numbers, which may embolden some Republicans to either do some bargaining or to change their tune. But all of a sudden, we're going to see that happen. Number two, you're going to see a lot of the agencies that Elon Musk and everybody else is going after. And look, people believe there's waste there. And so he's cutting it out. But you're going to see the sand start to grind in the bureaucratic gears. You're going to, it's one thing to say that you want an 8% reduction in the overall spending of the military in the United States. Another thing to get there, right? Like you can fire some people, but to try and get there with the contracts and all the interests that are there. So I think the real Trump administration, they talk about the first 100 days. We're starting to see now this flurry of activity that's caused a whole lot of stuff in the United States, but it's got a timeline that's going to start to grind, and his numbers are starting to move. The second thing is it's changed the dynamics in the world. And you can see where Macron and France, President Macron is now leading Europe, along with Canada and a group of others, to now form a new European Union. And I say that in a loose term, not in a formal term, to go in and be the protector of Ukraine, to set up new trading relationships, new security relationships, because they can't count on Trump. We're seeing now discussions in this country, and I hope it comes to fruition more than just talk, but interprovincial trade barriers that are going to have to go down, and we're going to have to do other things and consider how we're going to staff up not just our borders, but the north, that is a sovereign challenge. It's shaking up the world in many, many ways. So part of this is the United States, in the blustering aspects of the president, are very much, full of lots of lightning in a bottle and hubris right now. Why? Because they can. It's the beginning of their term, and they're going to do what they want to do. But I think, Brian, the grind is going to come probably around May. We're going to start to see that things are being challenged, and not just by the courts in the United States, but there's a reorientation going on in the world. Look at the Gaza. So let's not get into the politics of what's going on between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians. Look what's happened there ever since, Trump said, I'm going to take this over. It'll be a resort, and I'm going to get the King of Jordan here to accept all these people, and everybody will live happily ever after. Well, the King of Jordan said, no way. 30% of his population are now Palestinians who have moved there trying to overthrow him. So he said, I'll take in 2,600 kids with cancer, but nothing else. Goodbye. We've now got Egypt and the Qataris who have moved in with heavy equipment now to start clearing Gaza. So they've opened up this huge entry level into that area. So it's not the United States sending in bulldozers, it's Egypt and the Qataris. So they're moving ahead of the United States. So Trump is saying all of this stuff, but people are now starting to respond to it. They're not necessarily kicking back on the United States and calling him a whole bunch of names. They're finding ways to negotiate with him. So the head of Poland was in Washington this week, and Poland is an absolutely crucial negotiating entity on behalf of Ukraine. And so where was he? Well, the Polish president was meeting with Mr. Trump this weekend, and over at the State Department and also at the Defense Department. So Europe, Canada, the rest of the world is starting to catch its breath from all of this and find out how can we move in away from Mr. Trump so that we've got some new coalitions to fall back on. And I think this is what's happening. So he may be all, I like to say, look, it's not our country. But if you go what Tiff Macklin said the other day, all of this bluster about tariffs, people are already making decisions to move south of the border, right? We have steel orders gone. We have a retooling of the Ford plant in Oakville, which has stopped. That stopped. Like there's an impact already here, and we're going to see layoffs. The question is whether or not we can withstand all of that economic stuff before anything hits. And as Mr. Macklin said, if it comes to fore, we'll be looking at something that's worse than COVID that we may not recover from. I don't know whether that's going to happen, but I think if it takes a hit of 8.5% on the bottom line of our country's productivity, that'll be significant, and we're going to have to very, very quickly pivot to figure out how we're going to diversify ourselves and make this country productive. It
so
may
with an
be that we're better
8.5%,
for it, but I don't think we can avoid it in the short term. That's for sure.
With an 8.5% decline in GDP, that's a lot of layoffs. That's a lot of unemployment. That's a lot of lower incomes. That's a lot of challenges to people. This past week with Buy Canada, all the commercials that we saw that were all of a sudden very nationalistic Canadian, the I'm Canadian Joe rant with the victory in overtime. You've had a whole bunch of people becoming very pro-Canada, nationalistic, and anti-Trump. Does that change with an 8.5%? Do people start thinking about?
Well, I think, again, this ties into everything that we were just talking about federal. You asked me, how are we going to do 60 days from now or 80 days from now, whatever. I don't know. I don't know what's going to be on the table. I don't know what's going to be driving the electorate. I don't know what's going to be driving our pocketbooks, because these things all come in waves, right? So something is said or done. It's like an earthquake, and it kind of moves through the economy over time. And we're not feeling it yet. We're starting to see parts of it. And maybe there are certain companies and people who are feeling it. We're certainly not feeling the big stuff yet. I do think, even I think it was Thursday of last week, the forestry industry got hit with 25% tariff. Now, they're not here yet, but there's a catechism in the economic world of the Trump sphere that believes very much that it's not just about a negotiating position, but this is what needs to be there. Like, that's the difference.
Well, this Commerce Secretary that got finally confirmed believes and has for a long time in the power of tariffs.
Yeah, and so again, we it's almost like a Rubik's Cube, right? You got all kinds of different dimensions going on. You've got the domestic in the United States. You've got the grinding of all of that that's going to have an impact on political numbers and the ability of Congress and the Senate to try and reconcile and bring a bill forward to fund all of this. You've got, Europe doing its thing. You've got us and Mexico looking at each other. I would argue that if we can't have a decent discussion in this country that leads to actual action about lowering trade barriers across our own country, which are based on local interests and based on, a whole bunch of things that are built into the system that favor provinces and over others, then we're done. If we can't have action on that in this country, which we've said we would for all these years, then how can we expect to navigate a huge hit to our bottom line as a country and try and recover? So I think the Premier Ford started talking about that with the Premier of Nova Scotia in a scrum this week when he had him here in town, and then he's starting to talk about it in Washington. We're going to have to pivot very, very quickly to make our country more productive. And I would argue that the most important thing in the next 50 days is having the premiers of this country actually start to come up with a package that says on July 1st or on April 1st or on whatever date, these things are going to happen. Because if they don't, we're going to get caught in the backwater and the backsplash of the Americans. And there's going to be a lot of job loss, a lot of money poured out of treasuries for the support in economies, when in fact we should be really reorienting. Let's put it this way. In Trump 1.0, our total trade with the United States, total trade was 74% of our goods. and services. 74%. Trump 2.0, 74%. We had 4 years where we could have done something, and this country's gone nowhere. And so we're where we were before, and we better skedaddle and get on it right now, or we're going to be in a much worse place, I would argue, even 8 to 10 months from now.
I guess we need some leadership in Canada.
Well, we're going to get a whole lot of that, but we also, Brian, the only other thing I'd say is this. In 1990-91, I did surveys on the environment. And what we found then was a real feeling of guilt and pride. People were overwhelmed with the environment. They didn't know what to do with it. But when you introduced the concept of recycling in a blue box, people felt that they could do something about it. They put it at the end of their street. They put their recyclables in it. They felt guilty about that they weren't able to do something about it. They felt a lot of pride in order to do it, but they felt that they were doing something. So what do we got? We got the same situation here. We got a lot of guilt going on that, we don't know what we should be able to do, but we got to do something about it. So now we're at the grocery store and we're checking our iPhones to what products to buy. And we've got, we're cheering on hockey teams and, 25% of WestJet is now got, people not going to Florida. We've got individuals making decisions. But guess what? Just like then, the environmental issue is huge. It still looms. We got big issues here still looming with the Trump regime down in the States having ready to deal with this. It's going to take concerted leadership and maybe even bipartisanship here to deal with that. And I'm not sure, as you said, we've got leadership evident, but we sure don't have bipartisanship to deal with it.
No, we certainly don't have that. That's for sure. We got to take a final break for some messages and come back with quick concluding comments from our expert, John Wright, in just 30 seconds. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone. We've got John Wright, veteran pollster. John, this has been a great conversation. Really appreciate it. We've been talking about Ontario politics, Canadian politics, American politics, world politics, etc. I got to ask you, with the election coming up on Thursday, if you had a chance to sit down with any of the four leaders, and advise them on how they can change things with 4 days left to go, would you choose one? And if so, what would you say?
I wouldn't choose one. I'd say the same message, and that is get the vote out. That's it. I mean, this is what it's all about. Prepare for weather, but get the vote out. I mean, I'm even looking forward to next week, and I see, Kingston and Toronto getting snow on Friday. Well, what happens if it comes Thursday? So that's the first thing. The only thing I'd leave your audience with is this, and it's something we didn't talk about, but the Green Party. So, there we have Mike Schreiner, who I think everybody who leads the Green Party, well, he leads the Green Party in Ontario. Everybody believes that Mike Schreiner is a great guy, good guy, nice guy, and he's up there. But I don't, and he even was offered to take the Liberal Party. If I'm not mistaken, he had it offered up on a silver platter and turned it down. I don't know what the Green Party stands for anymore. The Green Party was out this past 2 weeks, and even in the debate, talking about everything except those things green, infrastructure, ODSB, a whole bunch of things that every other party talks about. And so the real question at the end of the day is, we're seeing the hollowing out right now of the NDP and maybe the Green Party there, because there's a change in the political dynamic in this country. I wonder whether the Green Party will do any better than the 2 seats it gets either federally or provincially. And I think if it doesn't, I think it'll be dead after this next election. But it's passing strange that we still have the Green Party around, and it's got the same kind of status as the other 3 parties on the podium for the debate, when in fact it's just like every other party. So let me leave you with this. I think it's going to be for Mike Schreiner and the Greens and everybody else getting the vote out in what could be in temperate weather. And secondly, Bonnie Crombie's got to be taking her local star candidates absolutely to the last wire, saying to the NDP, come and visit us, because we've got a better chance to hold their feet to the fire than you do. And I think that's kind of it. For the Ford folks, stay the course. It will be a majority government. It's just a question of how much.
John Wright, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take care.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. I got a really interesting lineup this week of some experts on Ukraine, some experts on Eastern Europe, some experts on defense in Canada. So please tune in every night, 9:60 a.m., 6 p.m. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. My podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media, my YouTube channel, as soon as the radio show goes to air. And Thursday night from 8 till 9:30 or maybe a little bit longer, I'm going to be doing a live show on election night. So join in. Thanks. Good night, everybody.